Welcome to the first lecture I'm giving on dialectical thinking. This lecture is a part of a larger set of programs and courses being offered by the Montparnasse Initiative School of Thinking. Um, the official workshop is taking place in Paris in between July 12th and July 18th, but I also wanted to make all of the lecture material that I'm providing available to you on YouTube. So if you took the course in person, or if you're just following my channel, you'll sort of know where my mind is at and what I think about dialectical thinking. So this course will also have a written component, a transcript component, which will be um, posted on my website as usual. The only difference is that the text on my website will probably be a little more formal, and this video is going to be a guide, an auditory and visual guide um, through the dialectical thinking course, and hopefully it's of use for you if you're a philosopher, if you're in any other discipline, or a graduate student. I hope that this sheds some light on what dialectical thinking is, how it can be used as a tool, and I want to make clear that in this course, what you'll be getting from me um, is not just a lecture on dialectical thinking, but also an introduction to my personal methodology, my background. I really want to inscribe myself into the course so that um, you can sort of also see the way in which I personally engage with dialectical thinking. So to start off, I think that I want to emphasize that this is meant to be very pragmatic, and meant to approach very concrete problems. Um, I'll give an overview of what we're going to be covering in a moment. But first, I'll just give sort of a meta level purpose of the course, which is I would like to situate dialectical thinking in between what I perceive to be deconstructive mode of thought, and meta-linguistic forms of thought. So on the one hand, with deconstructive forms of thought, um, what's emphasized is historical relativity. Um, Basically, what's emphasized is the historical relativistic nature of our constructions. That any construction we conceive, and any construction in which we engage with the world, is something not only contingent but relativistic. So there are no such thing as absolute truth claims, basically. There's no such thing as truth as we would think of it, say, in a religious perspective, um, as a transhistorical, eternal truth. It's just a particular contingent relative truth to you. Um, and then metalinguistic thought, I think, is something that is kind of on an eternal asymptotic approach to a universal language, some way to transcend our partiality, to transcend our limitation, to transcend our historical relativism. And you can see meta language, the striving for a meta language, to be really at the foundation, I find, of a lot of scientific disciplines, and disciplines in general, certainly, and religion as well. The idea that the language we have developed or we are developing, being some sort of universal communication medium that will persist for all time. Um, and like I said, I'd like to situate dialectical thinking between these two opposites, between historical, relativistic, deconstructive types of thought and a metalinguistic type of thought. So, what would that middle ground be? And for me, dialectical thought situates itself within what I'd say the eternity of rational discourse. That that there's a what persists across time, at least in language and logos, is the fact that we can, through our partiality, through our limitation, we can come to reason, and through reason, through engaging with reason, and not saying that reason's the only thing and reason's the truth, but that reason has some way in which it can transcend partial, by the subject engaging in a partial limitation, can transcend the partial limitation, because technically you could be anywhere, anytime, and as long as you are open and as long as you are attentive um, to reason, um, it could transcend any space or time that separates us. Um, so here, just to quote from the lecture material directly, quote, "The Hegelian reversal of this situation is precisely not to jump to the mystical beyond of language and representation, and neither is it to deconstruct language, but to counterintuitively see the potential in what most intuitively see as a limitation of the way in which the necessary self-limitation of reason directly unites the particular finite mortal entity, the creature, with the universal infinite immortal absolute." End quote. So what that means is that it's a coincidence of the opposites here, between that the reason of being um, is a way in which, even though I am a finite particular mortal, um, and even though there's no way in which I can objectivize myself with a meta language to go beyond my partial engagement with language, um, through reason I can be united with something that persists, and I think that even in Hegel and Plato, this insistence is very strong, that really philosophy, and the most important dimensions of philosophy, you touch something in language that, through reason, that um, is not merely um, historically relative, and at the same time it's not a type of objective global view of the whole situation. We are irreducibly partial, and we are irreducibly um, limited. So to give a sort of a psychoanalytic perspective on this claim, I just wanted to situate, I think, um, I feel like Jacques Lacan had two axioms that sort of capture these opposites of the deconstructive historical relativism and the meta language, the universal meta language of the absolute objectivization of our position. On the one hand, Lacan had the axiom, language is the torture house of being, and Zizek uses this axiom um, often. And it's a response to Heidegger's language is the house of being, and a language is the torture house of being is kind of I guess, a critique of naive humanism, and also a recognition that in order to make progress in language, in order to really make progress in language, you have to torture it. You have to really work in it. And if you don't really work in language and labor in language, then language will control you. It's kind of one or the other. It sort of reminds me of what Terence McKenna said when he said, "Culture is not your friend." And I think what he meant by that was that if you're not aware, if you're not infusing language with your spirit, then language will control you, and you won't really be speaking your own words. You won't really be thinking your own thoughts. You'll be thinking other people's thoughts and speaking other people's words. So it's worth thinking about that. The other axiom he had was there is no meta language, or there is no other of the other. And I would even say that's like a naive scientism. And what he meant by there is no meta language, there is no other of the other, basically meant that there is no way to get an objective universal language. There's no way in which um, you can then sort of eliminate the contingency and eliminate the partiality of your engagement with language. There's no way in which you can develop sort of a conceptual schema that is transhistorical, because we are historical. And this is sort of, I guess, a inability to understand really the relationship between language and the absolute, I suppose. So I think this conversation is really important in contemporary discourse. And specifically, I would say it's important in contemporary discourse um, between um, the emergence of language and the ideas of transhumanism. And what I mean by that is that both the emergence of language, the emergence of logos, it was a qualitative transition to a different type of experience and a different type of realm. And when we hear about transhuman visions, as is quite common, whether that's with something like mind-to-mind communication, like through brain-machine interface, whether it's through interaction with artificial intelligences, we get the image of another qualitative transition in mind, and specifically related to language. So when I situate dialectical thinking as the eternity of rational discourse, I'm trying, I guess, to situate dialectical thinking as a bridge potentially between the emergence of language with the emergence of humans and possibly some transhuman future. We don't know what that is. It's kind of, I would say, it's a mystery, even if it's, whatever the nature of that is, it's a mystery. So um, it could be that dialectical thinking is kind of the structure of our thought in its most pure form. That's how I think of it. So, or how have started to think of it. Um, so let me give one more quote from the lecture material. Quote: "What we appear to want is to infuse our language with our own most spirit, irrespective of its partiality and limitation, inclusive of our partiality and limitation, as opposed to being ventriloquist dummies of the symbolic order. Thus we are still very much in a mode of attempting to represent our partial truth in language, to give voice to our limitation. In the Hegelian sense, this truth is not the absolute eternity of an unmovable fixed ideality, but rather the coincidence of the absolute non-identity of eternity in a temporal becoming, where self-relativization or limitation and partiality brings one closer to the absolute, not further away." Okay, so I knew that was going to happen. I just put up a poster and it fell down. So It was going to happen eventually. I heard it ticking in the background. So now I'm just going to give an overview of the lecture material. So first, we're going to approach, instead of a meta language, I thought I would introduce the concept of a meta-ontology. And to me, a meta-ontology is basically something related to the axiom that I've been covering, if you're following the lectures on less than nothing, basically related to the axiom of the absolute as substance and subject. And I would situate meta-ontology as something different than a grand unified theory. So if you're scientifically minded, or if you're scientifically aware of the literature at the moment, and really over the last few few centuries, I suppose, the idea of a grand unified theory is persistent. Let's say, and many great thinkers and many great philosophers have tried to come up with a grand unified theory of everything, a theory that would explain everything. Um, perhaps two prominent examples today, which would maybe claim to be striving for a grand unified theory, would be probably a quantum gravity in physics. The idea that one day we are going to have a complete theory of the macroscopic and the microscopic, general relativity and quantum mechanics, and that when we develop this grand unified theory, we'll be able to explain the birth of matter, the death of matter, everything in between. Another probably contender for a grand unified theory might be self-organization theory and evolution. So in self-organization theory and evolution, there's the idea that we can explain all order, all organization in the universe on local interaction principles, so that the universe is totally relational, and that everything we see in the world is a consequence of things interacting with other things very locally to their particular place. Um, and both of those types of theories that seek to explain everything, um, I think the difference between them and, say, a meta-ontology is that the meta-ontology is interested in the position of the subject and the nature of the subject. It really inscribes, I would say, this paradoxical move, but essential for dialectical thinking, which is to inscribe epistemology as ontology, to see our knowledge as a very part of the becoming of the absolute. So the question for people who develop grand unified theories is more along the lines of action principles for them and their consequences in the world. So when you develop a grand unified theory, how is that serving you in the world, and what are the consequences of those abstractions in the world? So it and it also recognizes that the field of knowledge is itself divided between many different people, each of whom have their own grand unified theory, right? So it basically complicates things tremendously. But that this is the sophistication and the time and the delicacy that we have to take when approaching dialectics, because it's really hard to wrap your mind around that level of complexity and um, that level of nuance. So it's pretty difficult. Um, but I would say that the important sort of reason why we would want to do that, why we would want to bring up dialectics, and why we would want to inscribe epistemology into our ontology is really against what I interpret to be the postmodern insistence, which is that the map is not the territory. So you'll often hear, for example, like a common criticism against Newtonian epistemology, for example, which is probably the most dominant epistemology of the modern world, at least one of them. You'll hear the map is not the territory. And what the map is not the territory basically critiques is this naive notion of the scientist who can't differentiate basically between his abstraction of the world and the world in itself. So of course, again, if you're following along with my less than nothing lectures, you'll be aware that this gap between our abstractions and the things in themselves is something that gets a lot of attention in between Immanuel Kant, Johann Fichte, Joseph, I think, Schelling, and Hegel. And what I think that the dialectical method at its mature form inscribes is basically the axiom of the map has its own territory. The map has its own territory. Not the map is not the territory, but that your abstractions, your conceptualization schemes, and the way in which you engage with the world with them, they have their own geometry. And that's what we're interested in. Even if we can't see it, it's invisible geometry. And that's what it means, I think, to inscribe epistemology into ontology. And in that sense, what we're thinking about is not, say, an external view of quantum gravity or the external view of self-organization theory, but rather the way in which those theories are, in some sense, negations of being. The movement of them is the negation of being. That there's something about being that's incomplete. There's something about being that's lacking, and it's lacking not just in terms of our knowledge, but in it as well. That they're co lacking. They're co incomplete. So I think that really what you have to do with dialectical thinking is, and meta-ontology is, you must inscribe the observer within the system in a very radical way. Um, and of course, like as I said on the first slide, I want to give concrete examples of this, and I want to show how this is useful for thinking. And I really want this to be a tool that's useful. So we'll approach concrete examples, and I'll give my perspective at the end about what this means for how we should think about the absolute in the 21st century, because I feel as though we grew up at a time when thinking about the absolute, thinking about metaphysics was something almost looked down upon. Like it meant you were regressing into religion, basically. And I think dialectical thinking allows us to avoid this trap of feeling like we're digressing into religion. Um, and it allows us again to approach this oppositional constellation, I think, between a type of scientism which asymptotically approaches a meta language, and the more cultural studies, the more historical relativistic view, where there just is no absolute and stuff like this. So we'll approach these questions. So this is the first section. The first section, as I already described, meta-ontology, or map as territory, instead of um, the map is not the territory. And these are my major influences. So as I said, I wanted this to be a real not just an introduction to dialectical thinking, but also an introduction to me, what's influenced me, how I've engaged with dialectical thinking, fully accepting my partiality and my limitation, and at the same time interested in discovering knowledge and making progress in knowledge in a way that um, in some way transcends my partiality and limitation. Well, we'll see if I have done that. But I want to give reasons for why I engage with um, this particular stream of thought. Obviously, it's a very famous stream of thought: Plato, Hegel, Lacan, Zizek. This is this is not a obscure philosophically. These are big philosophical players. So the reason why Plato appeals to me, why I'm attracted to Plato, is because I feel as though Plato he his theories are capable of approaching both an emotional unity and oneness, with his theories of sex and his theories of love, and also a mathematical understanding of unity and oneness. You might even say his axiom would be something like, there is only one. Um, and that everything else, the cave world, which we'll get to, is a low level multiplicity of appearances. Um, and I really like thinking about this coincidence between emotional geometry and mathematical geometry. I really like thinking about the fact that there might be some higher order relation between these two, and it might even be at the foundation. I've started to think between some of the divides in contemporary philosophy, between people who feel like they're doing pure philosophy, pure mathematics, like maybe someone like a Quentin Mayasu, and maybe someone who's doing more subjective, emotional engagement, probably more along the lines of like what we're covering in What is Sex with Alenka Zupancic. So this, I think, can be philosophically grounded not only with the well-known fact that Plato's Academy um, had outside of its door, let no one enter who does not know geometry, or something like that, does not know geometry, does not understand geometry. And you might know, if you've read one of the great Platonic philosophers of our day, Peter Sloterdijk, who at the start of his Spheres trilogy, you'll see that what he said he would have outside of his academy is the axiom of, let no one enter here who does not understand love transference. So, on the one hand, you have Plato emphasizing the importance of geometry, the importance of mathematics, and of course, that's also reflected in a thinker like Alain Badiou. Um, and then on the other hand, you have someone like Peter Sloterdijk, who's also very influenced by psychoanalysis, emphasizing love transference. And that would be at the outside of his academy door. And I think that there's got to be some coincidence between these two, the way in which they're connected somehow. Um, you might even say the coincidence of the mathematical and the sexual. And I think, actually, I wish I had the quote ready to go, but I don't. But there's a quote from Alenka Zupancic, which I'll highlight in a future lecture, where she basically talks about how when you're reading a certain high level school of psychoanalysis, it's kind of like you're reading high mathematics in terms of the way it's structured around paradox, the way it's structured around certain precise axioms, the way it's structured around certain unsolvable riddles. So I think that it's worth reflecting on. Another reason why I'm interested in Plato is because he's in some sense the arch enemy of postmodernity, thinking in terms of multiplicities of multiplicities. So I have a quote here from Deleuze, from A Thousand Plateaus, which captures what the essence of his thought, and I think, and why Plato intrigues me as an arch enemy to this tendency. Here, the quote is: "The principle of multiplicity. It is only when the multiple is effectively treated as substantive multiplicity that ceases to have any relation to the one." End quote. So obviously, that's clear enough that what Deleuze's philosophy is trying to get at is a type of total disconnection from the one. Not that there's a negative one, not that there's a one that's present in its absence, not that there's a one that's effective even when it's not here, but that there's nothing of a one. There's just a multiplicity of multiplicities. And obviously that is a direct, in some sense, attack on Plato and Platonic philosophy and really the whole Western tradition. Because the whole Western tradition really does see a singularity, I feel. Um, and again, that singularity can be mathematical or emotional or sexual. Um, yeah, but I think that there's really a good philosophical challenge here in thinking through again this relationship between Plato and Deleuze, the one and the multiplicity of multiplicities. So why does Hegel attract me? Where does Hegel fit into this? I would say Hegel is really about the movement of the one. You know, if Plato is often criticized for his insistence on the fixed eternal ideality, Hegel here injects movement as fundamental. Um, In other words, the one or the absolute can no longer be thought of as a fixed transhistorical entity, and also can no longer be thought of as, in some sense, existing independently of subjectivity. And this is probably reflective of Hegel's time. Hegel was writing at a time of enormous transition, enormous rupture, enormous break with the old world. And that is captured in his philosophy. That Hegel very much saw the way in which the absolute was subjectively mediated, the way in which the problem of love and the problem of the absolute were very central to the historical drama, and that could be understood through rigorous dialectical mediation of this absolute engagement. So here to yeah, I'm gonna say another quote here directly from the lecture material. It says, the problem for Hegel, quote, approaches the problem of love as absolute oneness and the reality of a subjectivity seemingly divided from the absolute oneness in the mode of a subject-object division, opening onto a multiplicity of phenomena, end quote. So the way Hegel handles this, when we think about the one, I think we often think about this perfect sphere, this perfect circle, this circle that closes in on itself, that's complete in itself. And I think that what Hegel does here in sort of injecting movement is basically realizing that there's something lacking, or there's something missing, or there's a gap, or there's a hole that doesn't separate us from the one. It's rather that it's internal to the one. That there's something about the one that requires its appearing in multiplicity of phenomena. And this, I think, is where Hegel situates his dialectic. So the way I think about this is it's kind of like a transition, I would say, from the geometry of thinking of a global sphere, a perfect global sphere, like Peter Sloterdijk's Spheres trilogy, actually. And being able to think a local division or a local cut. And I think this also appears actually as Peter Sloterdijk's trilogy evolves. Um, because he goes, I think the first book is globes, and then the last work is spheres, or foam, sorry. And the transition from globe to foam is really this breaking of the one, like this one that's just a sea of a sea of ones that are dividing in themselves. Um, but here I actually have a quote from Slovenian philosopher Ladin Dollar, which he says represents the minimal level of Hegel, the essence of Hegel, if you want. Quote, what cannot be divided any further is the division itself. The substance is permitted by the void, but the ancients did not have any inkling that this would have any relation to the place of the subject. This is Hegel at his minimum. The place of the subject, in the adage of substance and subject, is the cut, introduced as the moving principle into being. End quote. So I really like that quote. And what that quote captures for me is precisely this it's not just atoms in the void, but you have to also describe the movement of those atoms in the void. And of course, the topic that comes up a lot in philosophy is the topic of Kleinemann, which actually, as Ladin Dollar emphasizes in one of his great papers on atoms in the void, which I recommend. Um, Deleuze also emphasizes Kleinemann as a type of curvature, um, as a type of formal twist, or a type of inherent distortion. That again, this gets at the idea of away from this idea of the perfect sphere, that the spheres in some sense internally disturbed, curved, um, in such a way that there's a movement, um, and that this is in some sense absolutized. So for Hegel, I think that this is in some sense, and we'll get at this maybe more deeply later, is this is how Hegel understands absolute love, as basically not getting rid of the one, but injecting movement in the one, trying to understand this movement in the one, historically constituted one. Now I'll move over so we can see our other friends. So the reason why I would also situate here Lacan is really on, and before I introduce Lacan, I would say that my task in engaging with Lacan here is to, on the one hand, I want to avoid obscurantism, because oftentimes that's a main criticism level that Lacan is obscurantism. And also, I want to avoid, I'd say, like contemporary scientism, um, in the sense that I feel like Lacan, properly understood, situates himself beyond both of these isms. Um, and in order to do that, I'd like to define precisely how I think of the unconscious. And this is a definition that I think is you know you find cited in Zupancic, and you'll find cited in Zizek. So it's not just my own definition of the unconscious, but I think it's a precise definition, so it's worth understanding. So the definition would be of the unconscious: a knowledge, a form, which does not know itself. So that's crucial. A knowledge which does not know itself. And that's I think a pretty precise definition of the unconscious. Um, and the reason why that's so revolutionary, a knowledge which does not know itself, is that it really it inscribes within the human sphere a type of impossibility, which we'll get to with Zizek, which Zizek really unpacks. It inscribed within the symbolic order the human universe, not something that can precisely not something that can be approached asymptotically, right? It's not that the unconscious is something that we will one day know through scientific technological advancement. Um, it it has as a constitutive element of itself um, the fact that it's not known by us, or not knowable. It's not knowable in principle. And that's, I think, why Lacan has such an easy time relating and engaging with Hegel and his dialectic. Because, of course, Hegel's dialectic is about the, the, the movement of the absolute. Um, and I would say that the straw man of Hegel is precisely that we're on this asymptotic approach to total knowledge or to complete knowledge. But I think that when you read, as Zizek does, when you read Hegel through Lacan, or vice versa, you read Lacan through Hegel, you realize that this is not necessarily the nature of the absolute. Um, we have to be much more humble with our knowledge, and at the same time, what the unconscious does is it also allows us to avoid historical relativism and deconstruction, because the unconscious as a form of knowledge that does not know itself is operative even if you think you have analyzed your own epistemology, your own abstractions. It's still operative. It, it's not really your choice in some sense. So that gives us a type of in some way it's an invariant principle. Um, but I would just want to say that in my experience, since sort of learning about psychoanalysis and engaging with psychoanalysis, what one thing I've noticed that's interesting is that scientists in particular, I would say that it goes both ways. So on the scientist end, and I would say on like the postmodern or the deconstructive side, there's a type of absolute recoil when it comes to introducing psychoanalysis into a discussion. Um, and I guess it's kind of obvious and intuitive why that would be on both sides. So, like, on the scientist side, there might be a recoil because the scientist operates on knowing and operates in a discourse of knowing. So when you inject a discourse that must inscribe not knowing, um, yeah, there's kind of like a huge clash here. Um, but I think the reason why the unconscious is crucial to think for philosophers today and for scientists, if it is that the unconscious definitely does not refer to what's discussed as the subconscious in neuroscience. Um, when we think about like neuronal processes which influence our behavior, um, but are activated before self consciousness, this is not really what Lacan is talking about with the unconscious. Um, so the distinction here between the two is important and worth emphasizing in the contemporary discourse. And then on the other hand, um, in regards to like the historically relative people or the deconstructive people, the unconscious I think is important because it's really on the level of desire. And if you know the objet petit a, like the central concept in Lacan's edifice, what the objet petit a is a partial object, so it's experienced as a partial object, and it's unsymbolizable, so it's not deconstructible, it's not symbolic. Um, It's actually something that more corrodes symbolism from within, like reason's own most otherness, if you want. Um, and that it operates as a type of stand in for the lack of unity. So, already here you can see sort of why there might be some obvious connection between Lacan and Hegel and Plato already. Because the object petit a often represents for the subject a desired unity. And that this representation of a desired unity, often captured in a master signifier, um, is really just the consequence of the subject's own division, or in Freudian terms, a consequence of the subject's own repetition automatism. So, when we reach the sexual and the political in particular, as I would emphasize watching the What is Sex lectures, um, we see this, what Lacan would call an indivisible remainder, as the object petit a, that this is not something that you can get rid of through deconstruction. It's still operative in these communities. So, yeah, that's my where my interest in Lacan lies. So now to move finally to Zizek, um, what he does that I think is interesting is obviously he ties all of these figures together in a very interesting way in Less Than Nothing. It's sort of a Hegelian Lacanianism, but it's also Platonic, because you'll notice in the first few chapters of Less Than Nothing that Zizek really tries to make the case that Plato is worth returning to and reviving today. And you'll catch that in my lecture series on Less Than Nothing. But what Zizek adds to this tradition is, which I think is essential, is trying to understand the status of impossibility. So what Zizek does is it inscribes impossibility as the real of a partial limited engagement. That in the realm of subjectivity of partial limited beings and language, what 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 holds them is this impossibility of self-realization, this impossibility to objectivize oneself. Um, if we're thinking again of this circle or this sphere that can't close itself, that's internally thwarted, that's internally divided, um, I would say that the real as obstacle, or the real as impossibility, is that part of the circle that can't quite that part of the circle that can't quite close itself. That what say that little piece of the real, that little piece of the real is what resists your desire. And I would say it's nothing but a formal curvature, or nothing but the 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 openness and the incompletion of the state space, say. Um, and that this impossibility, actually, and this is important for dialectical thinking, this impossibility is what structures the unity of the opposites. Um, the dialectical unity of the opposites, as I think, which you'll find in Plato and Hegel and Lacan, that this is a constant. So, um, but I think also very important to emphasize today is, there's this tendency today I've noticed in physics and evolutionary theory and all types of philosophical ontologies to see as this great cognitive breakthrough, um, this idea of relationality, as if we think about everything in the universe as relational as opposed to absolute, um, that this somehow helps us conceptualize the universe in a totally new way, in a totally radical way. which is not necessarily true because relational ontologies have existed for a while. But what really is radical about, I think, both Lacan and Zizek is their emphasis that even if being is relational, and there are passages in Zizek where he says explicitly everything is relational, that what's interesting about the human universe, and specifically sexuality and politics, but other fields as well, is what Zupancic would call the non-relation, which is basically where Lacan situates his axioms of there is no sexual relation, or what Zizek emphasizes, there is a non-relation, or there is a non-other. And I think this is really a much more radical ontology because it forces upon us the negativity at the core of relationality, and invites us to explore a paradoxical ontology, where we're not just thinking in terms of relations between things present, but also the unspoken absence at the heart of things present, if you like. And why this is practically useful, pragmatically useful, and theoretically very interesting is that it's really, this is where I think Zizek situates his understanding of the problem of something and nothing. The problem of something and nothing, obviously, and his engagement with the concept of less than nothing is central to less than nothing. And this non-relation, this impossibility of relation, is sort of how Zizek deploys in his schemas the dialectical machinery to approach this creation ex nihilo, this creation of something out of nothing. And the way in which he goes about it is innovative. And I actually resonate, that's why I'm covering less than nothing, I resonate with it deeply. So to be specific on the question of something and nothing, I've often thought that from the beginning of modern science, that if and what science represents is a type of radical openness to discovery of what's surrounding us in terms of our otherness, that it could well have been the case that when we develop the technology to probe into the deepest levels of reality, that eventually we would have seen, looking back at us, the absolute other, God. It could have been, that's not how it turned out, but it could have been that way. So, we didn't know. So when we probe down to the microscopic realm, maybe we would have thought we'd get to the lowest level of being. And actually, in the Newtonian framework, they didn't think there was a lowest level of being. They thought it was continuous and infinitely divisible. Only with Einstein did we realize that that's not the way it is. But what we find in quantum mechanics is that the fundamental level of being is not something, not an absolute substantial eternity, but rather kind of like the eternity of a virtuality, this paradoxical quantum void, this double vacuum, this it's really strange philosophical entity. And so the way Zizek engages with this is that he doesn't ask the question, the standard question, why is there something rather than nothing? Which is actually a question that comes from Leibniz, or not, maybe it doesn't come from Leibniz, but it's a question that Leibniz emphasizes strongly. What Zizek emphasizes is, why is there nothing rather than something? So he and this is part of Zizek's methodology, is he'll flip into its opposite something that's common knowledge or that's common understanding. and why is there nothing rather than something approaches this in a radical way, both on the physical level and on the spiritual or the human level, which is why is there this absence on both sides? Why is there this void on the physical side where nature seems to be incomplete, indeterminate, unknowing of its own self, right? It's kind of like the unconscious does a knowledge that doesn't know itself. And this is kind of inscribed into nature, like quantum mechanics is nature's own unconscious. And on the other hand, for us, why are we these beings who strive for immortality and eternity and all these metaphysical things, like with religion and with philosophy, and yet we all die? We all face the void of our own dissolution, right? So I think this is what Zizek's getting at, and trying to think this simultaneously. Um, so that is sort of my introduction to the major influences, but I don't want to just leave it there, um, because I want to approach the way I'm thinking about these works and these thinkers is not in a progressive linear development. So if you're following my lectures on Less Than Nothing or What Is Sex, you'll notice very quickly that these philosophies do not subscribe to a linear progressive ideology. What's emphasized is circularity and the movement of circularity, even the eternity of circularity. But the eternity of circularity isn't a pre-modern or traditional or ancient circularity. It's a twisted circularity, a paradoxical circularity. There's something here different. And when I think about these influences in my philosophical engagement as themselves in a paradoxical circularity, it's not that we're going from Plato to Hegel to Lacan to Zizek. We're putting them together in a circle in such a way as that the new transforms the old. And this is really the difference, I would say, between a standard action ontology and the notion of retroactivity. So, with retroactivity, what's happening is basically that a future oriented subjectivity will, through its own action, transform what we think of as the past. So, to give an example with that, I gave the concept of the oneness with Plato, the movement with Hegel, the unconscious with Lacan, the impossible with Zizek, and the claim would be that by thinking the impossible, by thinking the unconscious, by thinking movement, that we can rethink the one. We can go back to Plato with these notions, and we can make new sense of Plato. So it's not that Plato's first and then we move on to Hegel, we forget about Plato. It's that we use the new to shed new light on the old, to bring it back to life in a new way. So here I have a quote directly from the lecture. So, instead of totally destroying the works that feel to us outdated, we can instead see the old in the light of the new, where a new thinker, by first working through the old, allows us to see the old in a totally new way. And this is what I claim can be done with thinkers like Lacan, Hegel, and Plato. In other words, when we think the contemporary understanding of virtual impossibility qua potential, how does this change the way we think about the historical dimensions of the unconscious, movement, and unity? How can these dimensions of historical thought be rethought in light of new presuppositions? End quote. So, Now I'm going to move on to basically the meta-ontology in a network's perspective. So in the in a meta-ontology from the network's perspective, we're type of asking ourselves, you know, what is philosophy? Does philosophy have an impossibility? Does philosophy have an unconscious? Does philosophy have its own movement, its own negative unity, right? Either as love or geometry or both. Um, and I think that what I want to do here, obviously, in this representation, what you get is a standard relational network of minds in the symbolic order who are a part of the becoming of the absolute. And I am not above or below this network. I'm a part of this network, partially limited, engaged, just as they are. But what I want to do is show the way in which when we think about the impossibility, when we think about the unconscious, when we think about movement, when we think about the oneness, the unity, there's a potentially a different way to represent this. Um, and so I'll show here. This is inspired from my lecture material, which is the inscription of the impossibility as a non-relation in the philosophical universe as this impossible oneness around which our minds circulate. Um, and the reason why I think this is a better representation, I think, than the standard representations. I'll move this down so you can see other people I'm representing here. Um, the reason why I think this is a better representation is I think it allows us to think the way in which even within philosophy, we struggle to relate to the other. Maybe even especially in philosophy, we struggle to relate to the other. That there's a non-relation at the core of the absolute that structures our discourses. You know, so you can see this, for example, like if like I noticed it, for example, in a lecture between Slavoj Žižek and Graham Harman. Where Zizek would be more emphasizing the object A, what you might call philosophical philosophy, or sorry, no, psychoanalytic philosophy, and Graham Harman was emphasizing object-oriented philosophy, to which Zupancic would respond that what we're doing is object-disoriented philosophy. And there's just an inability to relate in the sense that Graham Harman continues believing what Graham Harman believes. Zizek continues believing what Zizek believes. There's no way to mediate the two. They just circle this impossibility. Um, and we have to think the network inclusive of this, right? It's not just, in Deleuze's words, a multiplicity of multiplicities, without any one at all. There's a negative one. There's this non-relation at the core. But you can also go deeper, and so I want to go deeper. And here you see another historical era represented. Um, and what I'm trying to think here is, in kind of sense, can we do an archaeology of knowledge, like Foucault's archaeology of knowledge, but without the historical relativism? Can we do an archaeology of knowledge which situates itself in relationship to a type of, I guess, a transhistorical impossibility, which inscribes contingency into its core? Knowledge is still contingent to the problems, to the impossibilities, to the obstacles, to the real of a time. But there's still something of the becoming of the absolute here. Something which overdetermines our discourse. Something which prevents us all from agreeing. Something which prevents us all from getting on the same page, so to speak. And my point of representing these things is also to sort of help you potentially, if you're following along, um, to sort of play and represent and think about the nature of this symbolic order. So you can even go further back into time to the ancient world, and this is trying to get at a sense of the texture of the symbolic order, the texture and the becoming of the symbolic order throughout history. And I think some of the questions that come to my mind here are, what are the first questions that the human mind um, comes to find of great importance? Why does the human mind come to find these questions of high importance? How do we view these same questions today? Um, take, for example, the idea of oneness or unity. How was this conceived in Plato's time versus how was this conceived um, at other historical epochs and in other various networks? Um, but I'm also showing this because I'm also showing you not only the history of my thought and with Plato, Hegel, Lacan, and Zizek, but the history of thought and the way in which you can play with this in the sense of, you could take any one of these thinkers on any levels and construct your own meta-ontology in some sense. So in order to sort of demonstrate this in a different way, I'm going to cover somewhat no matter what. So in order to represent this in a different way, obviously the previous representations were first inspired by networks theory, rhizomatic thinking, and so forth, and then I inscribed an impossibility at the core of the network. But one might also find it useful to use the metaphor of curved space-time in Einstein, because in Einstein's curved space-time and the Riemannian manifold, for example, things are still all relational, but what's internal to general relativity, what's internal to Einstein's thought, is actually that there's impossibilities in the field, represented as black holes, singularities, Big Bang, and this might be a way of conceiving the history of the symbolic order, perhaps, where each map as territory. That's what I mean by meta-ontology, map as territory, is the becoming of all of these webs of thought across time, and the way in which they curve and warp and distort the space around their own historical point of impossibility. And somehow we're all participating in the becoming of this manifold, this manifold of the symbolic order. And I think what you think about with this, not only is it not just relations of being, but relations of being plus impossible negativity, but also rather the effectivity of symbolic curvatures, if you like. So again, going back to this, overcoming the way in which we think about map as, deconstruction, just deconstructing the map is not the territory, versus thinking the effectivity of the map, right? So instead of thinking about the way in which it's silly to think that Newton's epistemology doesn't actually get at the real of the in itself of nature, what we want to ask rather is, how is it that Newtonian epistemology ended up getting humans to the moon, right? That's a huge transformation that's symbolically mediated. And I think there's a great lecture by Zupancic where she effectively says this, like that humans went to the moon on the field of Newtonian epistemology, and philosophers didn't notice. So I think we should notice. I think we should notice the way in which these maps curve and distort being and allow for transformations that otherwise would have been impossible. So there's also, like, the impossibility is not transhistorical in the sense that it doesn't change. The impossibility itself changes. Zupancic more talks about that the impossibility of the time informs the possibility. The possible relations are informed by its internal points of impossibility, I would say. So here you can see here another representation of this, and you see mine this is mine here on the left, Plato, Hegel, Lacan, Zizek. But I just want to show that, you can play with these structures potentially. You can play with these meta-ontologies, and it could be a career's long work to take a certain field of thought and to see, by playing with this field of thought, what you can think, if you think this field of thought. Where does it take you in your thinking? What can you think something that's never been thought before by playing with a particular curvature? And I think we do this spontaneously anyway, but just making it explicit here. Yeah, just making it explicit. So I have one more slide before we get into, and again, just wanting to emphasize that this curved manifold is actually something that curves and curls in on itself, and that perhaps what we get when we think this object of curving and curling all the different symbolic textures of all the different times in on themselves is that, we get a meta-ontology that is really a reflection of us trying to understand ourselves. And this goes back, I guess, to one of Zizek's points, that what happens in the human universe is that what emerges is this impossibility of self-objectivization. Might be captured in this symbol here, for me. So now, finally, you might be thinking, we can start with dialectics. And what are dialectics? Why dialectics? And how can we use dialectics? So the first thing emphasized is that dialectics are basically a conversation or a discourse that's mediated by reason and aiming for truth. And it's not a truth, obviously, it's not a truth that is, well, at least I'm not conceiving it as some fixed, substantial entity, but something rather that requires that in our discourse that we stabilize it across time. And that's the point of our conversations, and that if we can raise our minds to the highest level of reason, then what we're doing is that we're participating in a eternal act of trying to understand what is true, about being and about thought and about our relationship to being. So what Plato's starting point is with dialectics is, in some sense, he recognized that in our conversation, in our discursive reality, and in our phenomenal reality, what tends to happen is that we fall into oppositional determination. We fall into contradictory appearances that structure a lot of conflict, and that structure a lot of misunderstanding, and that structure a lot of our inability to see the way in which we're singularly entangled, as one basically. So the oppositional determination that stimulates and motivates Plato from the beginning is the oppositional determination between, I would say, religious zealotry and nihilistic sophistry. Where religious zealotry would have this idea of the eternal one that's that exists independently of us for all time, God basically, and the nihilistic sophist would be more of a, I suppose, someone who believes that there's no meaning in the universe, that we're just here for no reason, and it's perhaps a realm of doxa, a realm of opinion. There's no truth that you could order or organize your world by, which the religious person believes absolutely there's an unquestionable truth around which we can organize our world, the truth of God. Um, so that's an example of the type of oppositional character, the type of contradictory character of a human discourse and existence that Plato really wanted um, to approach with the dialectic in a more sophisticated way. Um, so, as is, basically common knowledge, there are dualities everywhere. For example, light and dark, order and chaos, masculine and feminine, life and death, peace and war, health and sickness, temporality and eternity, movement and stillness, something and nothing, right? Um, and the dialectic is what helps us to untangle the paradoxes and the contradictions of these dualities, allows us to approach them in discourse in a way that sheds new light on their singular coincidence, I would say. And the mechanism basically by which dialectics approaches this is, you could say, the thesis, the antithesis, and the synthesis. So, pardon me. So, it's a type of triadic logic. So you could have, and here the important thing is with the triangle, is that the third term, the synthesis, the third term, is never a complete closure. It's rather that the synthesis leads to a new oppositional determination. So it sets forth a new motion of coincidental oppositional structure. It's kind of like the one cannot hold itself in time. And so it again bifurcates and divides. So we could give a quick example of triadic logic with Plato's original query. The thesis might be something like, there is a God, one. The antithesis might be, there is no God, no one. And the synthesis might be through historical time. Like, for example, in this lecture right now, the synthesis might be, there is a not one, right? So there is positive determination, a not one, a negative entity. So you might take that as an example of the way in which a thesis and antithesis can be brought to a new reconciliation, but that new reconciliation then forces us to ask more questions. It forces us into new discourse. It doesn't simply end there, is my point. So, what are dialectics? Now, why dialectics? So, the why of dialectics to me is basically to avoid freezing your reason, right? So you'll see this in a lot of courses, a lot of discourses, that people tend to frame their discourse as if it's frozen in eternity. They try to frame their discourse as if now they've got it, now they've solved it. And I think what dialectics force us to confront is the movement of reason, that there's no system that can close itself off, as it were, and complete itself. And I think that when we submit, in some sense, to the dialectical process, when we submit to the fact that every conjecture, every reason we can give is not the final reason or the final conjecture, but just another conjecture, another reason in the series of reasons which will um, continue indefinitely. Um, we don't necessarily give up truth, but that we recognize that the truth is our very path of becoming. That we are the temporal annihilation. We're the temporal annihilation of the truth. And say it like this. And so then what we as philosophers interested in the dialectic are able to approach with a type of rigor and a type of with perhaps novelty injected into our discourse in an interesting way, is we're studying the discursivity of forms of historical self-consciousness. So it's really, to me, so interesting and so invigorating to be able to do this, because you can sort of take a field of thought, and you can sort of see above, as it were, or below, the oppositional determinations which structure the characters of this field. I think there are some people who do this really well. I'm off the top of my head, I'm trying to think what stands out to me is, I've been studying a lot of quantum gravity, and I've been studying the discourse, and I've been specifically paying attention to the forms of historical consciousness which are becoming in this field. And I love studying the way in which two figures in this field will approach the same problem differently, or be able to sort of see maybe the way in which two forms of consciousness are um, um, producing each other, as it were. Producing each other. The problem is the very way in which they're interacting, the very way in which they're relating to each other. And that if there can be a synthesis between them, um, their very characters would dissolve. The opposition of their characters would dissolve. And again, I want to get into concrete examples of this, so I'll save that for towards the end of the lecture. But what I want to emphasize now is really the fact that the genius of Plato and Hegel is that the very structure, what separates them in some sense, is that the very structure of their discourse is higher order. The very structure of their work is, the dialectic is built into it. In other words, it's triadic. So the very structure of their work is a dialectical discourse mediated by thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And this is sort of like the machinery of the machinery of their ideas, and how they're deployed. So I think that I'd imagine when you become very sophisticated with your understanding of the dialectic, that this can be infused into your work in a very meaningful way, in a very creative way, potentially. So let's go into some examples. So we start with Plato. And with Plato and his meta-ontological triad, as most people know, you learn it in any philosophy course, is that you have the world of um, the physical world, you have the mental world, and you have God. You have the absolute. So the physical world and this is the cave allegory. So, the physical world um, is the cave world, the illusory multiplicity of phenomena and sensation that the mind is perceiving. And what is truth in Plato, what is good in Plato, what is beautiful in Plato is is the one, is God, and that reality is suprasensible. That it's not our sensations, maybe our sight, our smell, our taste, our hearing, our touch. It's the mind's eye, if you will, the suprasensible. And many different spiritual traditions talk about this, so it's not necessarily unique. So let me give a quote from the lecture. Drawing on the famous cave allegory, the world is something of an illusory multiplicity. The illusory multiplicity is what we would place on the level of sensation, what we can perceive with our senses. The mind or the mental is what perceives this cave world. And in dialectical materialism, we focus on dialectically mediating the emergence of truth, as understood in terms of the purely formal, suprasensible surface of an event. End quote. So you can see here why thinkers like Badiou and thinkers like Zizek present whoa, that's weird. So my video is, you can see here, not functioning. That's weird. See if I can get that going again. Sorry about this, but it will be. Okay, so sorry about that. So you can see I was saying with Badiou and Zizek, why they would separate democratic materialism, which has an ontology that is just bodies and languages, with dialectical materialism, which they say is bodies, languages plus truth. That we're not willing to give up in this philosophical tradition. We're not willing to give up the mediation of the truth. That it's not just basically a pure multiplicity of multiplicities. I suppose. It's not just anything goes. It's not just any direction is correct. It's not that there's no up and no down. There's an up. There's a direction. There's a way forward. There's an orientation, and this is in relation to the suprasensible truth of being or of reality. And understand the dialectic is trying to understand the movement of this. So in relation to the Platonic one, even though that the Platonic one maybe has a difficult time understanding movement, and maybe has a difficult understanding of, or a lack of understanding of, say, the unconscious or impossibility, as we're inscribing now, we do have this idea of the truth as a oneness which orients us. So I would say here, to quote quickly, in Plato's Parmenides, he has the quote, "Human nature was originally one, and we were a whole, and the desire and the pursuit of the whole is called love." So I think this is what really, Badiou and Zizek and dialectical materialists don't want to give up, which is this unity of love, this driving, this motive force or this structuring force in its absence of love that we see and that we find in our life, structures the way we want to relate and the way we want to become and the way we want to express our spirit. So I think that it's worth reflecting on. Let's see here. So here you have the axiom of Plato being monism, basically, the philosophy of the one. There is only one, that everything is all wrapped up into one somehow. And again, what Plato can't really approach is the movement of this. So we might speculate, right? I'm tempted right now to give some speculations on how these are all connected in movement. Like we could easily situate this ontology, as is done actually, in Roger Penrose's The Road to Reality. If anyone looks up that book, you'll find Platonic ontology. We could easily situate, for example, the Big Bang as the birth of the physical, as God giving birth to the physical, and then the physical giving rise to the mental, and then the mental returning to God in history around the becoming of the one. And even Christian ontology here is helpful. So, it is still possible logically to hold this ontology. And I think that even if you don't buy some of those speculations, I think that really the importance of going back to Plato instead of maybe say having my starting point at Buddha is here. I have a quote about why I think that's maybe, at least for me, a more interesting starting point is, quote, Plato emphasizes that there is a truth in the appearances, but that it must be dialectically mediated. It must be understood by better understanding our maps of meaning. This, as far as I am aware, is the elementary distinction which separates Buddha and Plato, end quote. So what I mean by that is that in Buddhism, the appearances are just appearances, and there's no truth in the appearances. Like, there's no truth in the dialectical mediation of opposites, that you just sort of recede from the appearances. So that to me is not something that resonates with me. It's not something that resonates me in the sense of, it means I have to give up my quest and my engagement with knowledge and history, which is, it doesn't strike me as the truth. That's me. So now, what happens with Hegel and Lacan? Let me see if I can get both. I'm in the middle. Okay, so what happens with Hegel and Lacan is really a complexification and a sophistication of the Platonic ontology. But it's the same structure, you can see. So there's still the triad. It's just the triad and the nature of the triad is different. So with Hegel's triad, you have nature, logic, spirit. And with Lacan's triad, you have imaginary, symbolic, real. Now, the point of Hegel's triad is to study historical phenomenology. So again, as I said, to study the movement of the one. And Hegel starts this. So you can see actually that, nature correlates with the physical, logic correlates with mental, spirit correlates with God. In Lacan, the nature becomes imaginary, logic is symbolic, and spirit is real, the real. And the real is a more complex concept. So we, these are not totally equivalent. I think there are distinctions here that emerge that are worth diving into in great detail. But there's some rough homology, I say that. So with Hegel and historical phenomenology, the spirit becomes in relation to logic and nature. So the interaction between logic and nature. So it's like a logical sublimation of nature. So the idea is externalization in nature and its return to itself. And in this process, that's what constitutes spirit. That's what constitutes spirit, is this externalization and return, this externalization and return to itself, and its own center of gravity, if you like. So, in the process of this relation between nature and logic, I guess what Hegel would say is real is what's left of nature after logic has sublimated it, basically. Like, the way I think about that sometimes is that, like once you've logically sublimated a natural object, you kind of can let it go. Like I remember when I was 17 and I was just thinking nonstop about Jupiter, for example, or the Andromeda galaxy. And now I don't anymore. I've approached those structures with logic. I've internalized them, and now I'm moving on to something that I don't know. So that's what I mean by spirit and nature, I guess, is what's left after logic has done its work. Now my focus is maybe more now I think about black holes all the time, or the Big Bang all the time, right? Because they're more engaging. I haven't yet sublimated these objects. I don't understand them logically yet. They're more difficult. With Lacan's triad, he's more, instead of getting at historical phenomenology, he's getting at the structure of human psychology, and specifically, psychoanalyzing human psychology from the perspective of the unconscious. Um, and the relationship between all of these terms here change in subtle ways. There are subtle differences that are worth going into. As you can see, sort of with nature becoming imaginary, you sort of have this idea that we're not, of course, he's totally affirming this transition between Kant and Hegel, where we're not getting at the things in themselves of nature, like nature's just there. What we're really getting at is the way in which our imaginary, the way in which the territory of our mind is reflected to us as an otherness. And the way in which we do that is through symbolic operation. So and then we try to realize something that's real. And then the most important thing to know about the dimension of the real in this structure is that the real is kind of, like I've said before, like a constitutive absence or a constitutive obstacle, which internally structures the symbolic in some sense. And the relationship between these three terms really captures the way in which one can read Lacan, or one can read Hegel, or one can read Zizek. So they're a little more sophisticated, a little more complex than Plato's work. But I mean, I think they're all connected here. Let's see. So yeah. So I get that the title "Spirit is a Bone." So now, in regards to thinking this dialectical structure, this triad, we're trying to think the identity of the opposites and their mediation in the paradoxical third term. So in this situation, the synthesis or the real will be the C. So this element which allows for a further transformation of the identities of the opposites A and B. So the thesis would be represented by A, the antithesis would be represented by B, or you'd say that A is the imaginary and B is the symbolic. And the important point to understand is that A and B co-constitute each other. That the movement between A and B means that if you took away A, B would disappear. If you took away B, A would disappear. That they depend on each other. They only exist in their relation to each other, and simultaneously, like I said, the impossibility of their relation to each other. And that, I think, is really the core of oppositional determination. I'll give some concrete examples of that. Now, the dialectic operates, in some sense, not on the position of A and not on the position of B, but from the position of C, this fuzzy indeterminate space, which is not, again, a higher positivity, but really, C has done its work when A and B dissolve as contradictory semblances. And that the mistake of self-consciousness is thinking that A is true or thinking B is true, instead of realizing that A is true in relation to the way you're relating to B, and B is true in the way you're relating to A, but neither of them are true in the sense that we are getting at dialectically, because they will both dissolve in their temporality and their historical mediation by the dialectic. I think that's important. I'm going to give some examples here on just to show what I'm talking about here in a historically raw way. So, in regards to, say, religious subjectivity, like I'll say pre-modern subjectivity, religious subjectivity, monotheist subjectivity, you can see here in the first category, A equals not A, which means, so basically, this is, I'm trying to get at basically deploying Johann Fichte's I equals I equals impossible image. So, of course, for religious subjectivity, you'd say its notional ideal of itself would be something like Jesus, right? Like the perfect subject. And A equals not A basically means that the religious subject can't be like Jesus. Like, it's too hard. It's impossible to have a symmetry. It's asymmetry. It's impossible to have a symmetry between these identities. So because of that, A passes into B is the idea. So because of A's own impossibility, it passes into B, and so then the religious subject becomes secular subject. And then with secular subject, have a new notional ideal. So of course, like the secular subject in its probably most extreme manifestation might be something like the subject who is carrying out world communism, say the utopian global utopia, or just the global utopia. The secular subject who wants to bring about, that's its ultimate notional ideal. Now, I think that where we are in our culture, where what we're reaching here as like an analogous time to Hegel's time, is that we are approaching the impossibility of this identity. We're approaching the impossibility of the naivete of the secular subject. The idea that the secular subject can in any way participate in the realization of a secular utopia. So I think in that sense, B has to pass into C, but it's unclear, I think, in our culture what C is. It's, again, we're in this indeterminate fuzzy space, and the identity of what C is hasn't emerged. And I could wager some speculation. I'm like I said, I'm very much inspired by Less Than Nothing, and I have some ideas from Less Than Nothing about what the identity of C looks like. But I haven't yet brought myself to the level of conceptualizing it concretely. On the level of the collective, say, you have the same pattern. So because the subject and the collective of subjects, the intersubjective, they mirror each other in some ways. They're all connected. So you'd say the religious subjects make the church, and the church's ideal is the kingdom of heaven, but A does not equal A. So by forming the church, you don't realize the kingdom of heaven, and this impossibility corrodes the identity of the church from within, and you might get the state. So A turns into B. But then the problem is that people relate to the ideal notion of the state in the same way, so that the ideal of the state might be secular utopia, right? And this is still very much alive in some sense. People thinking that the state can bring forth secular utopia. But again, I think we're reaching a limitation in this ideal, and maybe the state is corroding from within because of this impossibility. And in the same way as that we don't know what the C of the subject is, I think in the same way we don't know what the C of the next stage is, basically. We don't know what is to come of the subject and its collective organization. But this is a practical demonstration of the dialectic, because it allows us to understand the structure, and then it brings us to this little piece of the real that we cannot think in Lacan's terms. So I think it's useful. Now we've gone through dialectics. We've worked through it. Just its foundations, how I approach it. Now we can give some concrete examples. I'm going to run through these. These are just meant to be thought provoking. I'm not going to do all of the work, in the sense that I want to present the field as I see the field. And I just want it to be stimulating, thought-provoking, if you're a researcher, to take these oppositional determinations and play with them, engage with them, and maybe new thought will emerge from this engagement. So the first oppositional determination, I want to put it here, I think. The first oppositional determination, one I've already brought up, is the oppositional determination between quantum mechanics and general relativity. So it's the oppositional determination, so A equals B, say, and we can't think C, right? We can't think the coincidence between the micro and the macro. The consequences of resolving the micro and the macro, the consequences of actually coming up with C, would be a totally new understanding of the universe. We've reached our limitations in abstraction as we know now. So the micro world, in its incompletion, its uncertainty, its indeterminate, its fuzzy, involving paradoxes of observation. Somehow what is objective is inscribed into what is subjective. With general relativity, you have a physical world that's not situated in an absolute space-time background, but something that's a relational, dynamical space-time, relational, dynamical manifold that's locally or relativistically constituted. Also space-time can emerge from nothing and disappear into nothing. All of these are very strange things. So, we haven't been able to think this. Then you have another oppositional determination that, it's actually the oppositional determination that structured my emergence into deep thinking. If you look at my video on who I am, it's really, who I am became in relation to this oppositional determination, this A equals B, this impossibility of thinking, the evolution of change, and God as eternity. And really, I think it does, structure a lot of modern thinking. Like, my evidence for that would be that, evolutionary thinking, and especially in its manifestation today in cosmic or universal evolution, where the concept of evolution basically goes everywhere and can describe everything. Like Daniel Dennett says, it's a universal acid. And then there's still something that persists, paradoxically, in the religious eternity, at least on the level of our discourse, on the level of our historical engagement. The religious eternity is a real that never changes. It's a real that persists. It's a perfect unity. It's a perfect identity. It guarantees being as a unity. And this is something that really it causes a clash between evolutionary thinkers and religious thinkers, and we can't yet think the coincidence of these two structures. And I think it's worth it to think it. So then you have, say, the oppositional determination between sciences and humanities, where in the sciences you have external observation, formulating tests that can be repeated, locating ourselves in relation to a knowable nature, all of these things, trying to get at objectivity, some sense of objectivity, the collective observations, we can all verify them. In the humanities, you have more an emphasis on the experience of subjectivity. You have more that what's emphasized is that reality is most fundamentally a story, or reality is most fundamentally a narrative. Um, it's not necessarily objective. Um, it's more interpretational, more open to your interpretation. It's fundamentally, there can be a multiplicity of interpretations, and all are valid. And so this is a really difficult coincidence of the opposites to think, how to think these simultaneously. And I think, of course, with all of these oppositional determinations, you know they're all somehow linked. They're all somehow linked. And one side is not nonsense and the other side is not right. That's not a useful logic to deploy in dialectics. Related to the sciences and the humanities, you have analytical versus continental philosophy, and I know a lot of people don't like this distinction, and I, for one, I don't find it too useful either. But when I was reading about the differences between analytical and continental philosophy, how I understood it was almost a difference between a type of mathematical empiricism, like a rigorous knowledge that we can all universally demonstrate to all other linguistic subjectivity, um, emphasizing things like symbolic logic, um, basically collectively verifiable logics. And it seems like the continental is more transcendental in the sense that it is trying to get at, um, a universality that's internal to our phenomenal world, um, but it's an experience beyond logic. It's almost like the illogic internal to logic, to use a Zupancic's term. The illogic at the heart of logic. And what that means is basically experiences that cannot be demonstrated to an external observer, experiences that cannot be shared between subjectivities, but they're undeniably experienced, unrepeatable experiences, experiences that evade precise formulation in mathematics or logic. Um, so the way I understand this difference is it's the difference in communication almost, where the analytic camps want to emphasize information that can be communicated universally, and the continental camps want to emphasize information that is universally experienced. Even if it's not communicable, it's important. Now, the next one, this symbolism is obviously very provocative, and it represents the far ends of the political spectrums. So you have the left and the right, far left communism, far right fascism, and obviously there's a huge middle ground in between. Um, but what the far end of the left emphasizes and what the far end of the right emphasizes are in some sense opposites. So it's worth thinking on what these opposites are. Um, for communism, there's the emphasis on universal communitarian values. There's emphasis on imagining a world beyond capital, imagining a world beyond nation states, imagining a world that's humanist and international in its principles. Um, and it's about the inherent potential of humans to be far higher on a self actualization level, on a self realization level, than we are now. That history is a tendency, history is tending towards a utopian or a universal, humanist international order, and that we're mediating that process, some better than others, maybe. Um, and then on the far right, fascism, you have this idea of a concrete return, an imaginary return to national and ethnic tradition. Um, you have this return to a type of conservative foundation, the logic that what worked in the past can work in the future. And in that sense, you have basically an opposite, not just an opposite ethos, but an opposite temporality. And this opposite temporality is basically a temporality that operates on I like the term retrotopia, this idea of trying to reenact a past that never existed. Obviously, it's commonly, everyone knows the slogan "Make America Great Again." That's a retrotopic vision. It's a vision of reactualizing something that is only there in your imagination as a mythical past. And I think the conservative mind definitely operates on that more, and the progressive leftist mind operates more on a future directedness, the creation of something new that never existed before, and it has certain knowable properties. So connected to that, you also have the difficult oppositional determination between individuation and collectivism. Um, Individuation would emphasize, obviously, the becoming of the psychological unit, emphasizing the irreducible individuality of a psychology, um, and emphasizing that its potential to become different, its potential to become other, is a huge mystery, and we don't know the consequences of mass individuation or extreme individuation. Of course, there are figures of consciousness who have individuated very very deeply, you might say, but this is really unexplored territory. It's a territory where we're going to be walking in the 21st century. And then on the other side, you have collectivist notions, a more social notions. So about what's good for society as a whole, thinking about social becoming as a whole, thinking about like networks of people, thinking about groups of people, thinking about identities that transcend the individual, experiences that transcend the individual. Um, Thinking in a way where you don't just atomize individuals, that we're not just all alone and separate, that we're all together and linked up together. So again, these are oppositional determinations in some sense, and we can't think maybe both simultaneously. I know there are some Deleuzian scholars who had proposed things like, or I forget his name, but proposing the concept of a trans individuation, um, which captures both together. But yeah, it's another one worth thinking about. A equals B. So then the next one I want to emphasize is a more sexual one, which is masculinity and femininity. So this is a controversial one because the way I think about it is that these are fields, sexual fields, that aren't necessarily connected to biology, obviously, but they're still modes of expressing one's spirit in a sexual way, um, and that it's worth working through the paradoxes and the oppositional determination of man and woman, masculine and feminine, as opposed to emphasizing a multiplicity of sexual orientations, because um, even though the masculine and the feminine don't map onto biology, there's still a meta level structure in the masculine and the feminine that emerges in sexual interaction. Um, and just for interest's sake, I just wanted to name some of the metaphysical categories that have been attributed to either oppositional determination. So, um, which might stimulate thought on what maybe these are. I think these are mysteries, obviously, and I think even Freud and psychoanalysis, have a lot to say about these types of things. So, the essence of masculinity is often represented as a polarity of order, structure, authority, wisdom, tradition, and in metaphysics, temporality. And then the feminine is represented as a polarity of chaos, potentiality, love, care, surrender, and in terms of metaphysics, nature. So I think that going forward in the 21st century, obviously, these polarities are undergoing radical transformation, and we'll need to rethink them. The next oppositional determination is a long-standing one between matter and mind, physical and spiritual. The atomistic view of the universe, reducing everything to particles, parts and particles. That everything is made out of atoms. And then the mental view, the mind view, the spiritual view, that everything is reducible to spirit, everything is consciousness. Everything falls into consciousness, as it were. And that what governs the universe isn't physical laws of matter, but maybe you might say freedom of spiritual becoming. These are oppositional determinations that are very interesting to think as well. I mean, they've maybe been the primary one in structuring philosophical discourse. Then you have life and death. Life and death, I mean, is as fundamental as oppositional determination as you can get, really, because it overdetermines our whole existence. You know, we are alive. We didn't choose to be alive. We appeared here. We appear to be living systems that are based on biological principles, just like other organisms. There are differences, our self consciousness, our language, which give us a level of self referential architecture that maybe the other organisms don't have. And then on the other side, you have death. You have the fact that we are finite mortals doomed to a realm of inexistence, that every human that's ever been born has died, and that no matter how much you try to take care of yourself, no matter how much you know, death in existence is waiting for us. That will eventually basically fall to decay and disorder no matter what we do. So um, thinking the coincidence of these two, how are they interrelated? What's the imminence of these two in their interaction? This is another interesting thing to think. Then, I represent nothing by nothing and then something by the earth. So something versus nothing. And this is the final oppositional determination I'm going to discuss. On the one hand, something, you have the elementary existence of anything at all. You have either whether you're conceiving in terms of something as substance, whether you're conceiving substance as things, objects, whether you're conceiving something as relation, whether you're conceiving something as just a presence, existence itself. And then on the other side, you have nothing, which is usually referred to as a void or a void or a vacuum or a fundamental absence, either unaffective or affective, some or death as nothingness. And I think in some sense that like modern science and modern like more Buddhist spirituality both operate on this distinction of something and nothing, whether they know it or not. Science really operates, I think, on the something, what is there. And I think Buddhism has operated on the nothing, that the appearances that what we think is something is insubstantial, is nothing. So there's a coincidence of science and spirituality here, and I think it's worth pulling out um, logic and trying to make sense of this. So that was my tour, I think, through oppositional determination, and we're going to be coming close to the end of the lecture now, and I'm just going to emphasize some final principles that I think help me in thinking about dialectics and approaching these topics concretely. And I hope this has been interesting for you to learn about dialectical thought and how you might think for yourself some of these oppositional determinations that are structuring our field. Um, because I think we do need a return to metaphysical thought, basically. Like, I really do think that, you know, we have been in a knowledge world where, on the one hand, you have ontologies of quantum cosmology and the brain sciences and cognitive science, which really aim to eliminate traditional philosophy as I've been describing it here in this lecture. And then you have a type of relativism or constructivism, which structures a lot of cultural studies and historical relativism, historicism, which aims to eliminate any reference to a real absolute. And I think that these fields are exhausting themselves, and I think it's really time to once again think the absolutes. Once again, time to reintroduce metaphysics into the conversations and rethink our ontology, rethink ontologies. Period. Um, so let's just give my quick overview on how I have been thinking this. So on the one hand, it seems like it seems more and more that Western thinkers are tending towards Eastern metaphysics. And I think that why Western thinkers are tending towards Eastern metaphysics is because basically of a failure of Plato. So if Plato and monism is there is only one, then I think the Eastern absolute that people always emphasize is non-dualism. Like if you notice, non-dualisms become very popular. And I looked up the axiom of non-dualism is basically one undivided without a second. And one undivided without a second, what that means is basically that the world of appearances, that the world of duality is an illusion. It's fake. It's just appearances, and you don't need to engage with them. The truth is the undivision. The truth has nothing to do with the division. So you can see here with the Eastern absolute thinking and with non-dualism, there's no space for dialectical thought here because you just emphasize the inner void. There is no meaning to the appearances. There's no truth in the appearances. So yin yang, black white, good evil, light dark, day night, masculine feminine. Uh, these are all illusory appearances you should recede into the void. And what that sort of represents basically is, so you remember the A equals B of these parts struggling, and neither are the truth, but you want to get to the C term. In Eastern thinking, there's not this invention of logic, this C term, because the C term represents that actually by engaging in dialectics, you actually change the whole. That you're at war, the absolute. That's what when Hegel talks about the absolute at war with itself. He's talking about that our very partial, limited engagement with the truth changes the whole, right? That the whole manifests through the part, the individual. Whereas in the Eastern conception, you have struggling parts, but the whole is at rest. So that's really a metaphysical difference. That's really a metaphysical difference. And so, and it's one that I think that, wherever you stand, whatever argument you have for thinking these things is fine. But that's how I interpret it. And at the same time, this is a very good challenge for Plato. There is only one is not believable. And the reason why it's not believable is because people have a hard time believing something maybe that they haven't experienced themselves. And maybe it's impossible to experience the one. So there's much more a tendency to this non-dualism, this receding from the appearances. So let me now offer my counter. So that's Western absolute. I can cover this now. So my counter is a type of reviving the there is only one monism with non-monism, and this is often said in Zizekian philosophy of or psychoanalysis is more than one, less than two. More than one, less than two basically talks about the division and the otherness and takes it seriously. So the divided subjectivity basically, and it emphasizes basically that there's something in the symbolic chain. There's something about language. There's something about logos that continues to move even after you've deconstructed it or even after you've gone into your spiritual inner world, that there's something about the appearances, there's something about oppositional determination, which is um, essential for understanding the truth of being and the truth of history. And it's this, it's this as you see from the axiom more than one less than two. It's this impossibility of the two to become one. This impossibility at the core of the two trying to become one, which obviously structures a lot of sexual difference. Um, but it's our struggle. The emphasis of this view is that it's our struggle in oppositional determination, our partial limited engagement, which unites us with the absolute precisely, as I emphasized at the start of the lecture. So here I'm just going to a quote from the lecture saying, "Consider all the oppositional determination that structure modernity: quantum mechanics, general relativity, evolution, religion, science, humanities, communism, fascism, individuation, collectivization, masculinity, femininity, matter, spirit, life, death, something, nothing. What non-monism suggests is that these oppositional determinations can only be reconciled with the historical work of the subject." End quote. So it's saying that there is a point, the dialectical method is saying that there is a point in engaging with this realm of opposites. It's not just appearances, that there's affectivity in the appearances, basically. And I would say that that's also what the Hegelian axiom of the absolute is not only substance but also subject means. It's understanding this. So that, congratulations if you're still with me. That it's a long lecture, I know, and it's a lot of stuff, but I hope it's useful, and I hope it's thought provoking. And that brings us to the end of the lecture. So once again, just thank you for sticking with me if you're still with me. And I mean, I don't know what to say to summarize other than just off the top of my head. I feel like dialectical thinking is an incredibly useful tool. I mean, it takes a lot of time to really internalize it and to really understand it and to operationalize it. But I think that the benefits of doing so are are worth the effort. I mean, I think that you'll find that your ability to engage in history, your ability to engage with the other, your otherness, will be heightened. And your ability to make nuanced and novel interpretations of fields um, could be heightened. And this is no matter what field you're in. Like as I showed with all the oppositional determinations in this lecture, they transcend any boundaries. They're adisciplinary. Like it's in physics and it's in religion and it's in biology and it's evolution and it's everything. So it's a really interesting and a really useful tool of thought. I hope that's what I've been able to show and demonstrate in this lecture. And once again, just thanks for sticking around, and I hope to see you again next time.